Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to English 101. I'm your instructor, Todd Sull. Hey, today I have a short video to help you understand the proper way to give credit in MLA citation style or MLA format. Now, for some of you, this might be brand new. For others of you, maybe this is something you did in high school or you've been using in your other college courses. But never fear, wherever you're at on the spectrum or the scale here, I prepared kind of a short basic introduction to show you how this all actually works. So I'm going to take you through some slides and I'm going to show you a student example at the very end as well. So, by the way, MLA stands for Modern Language Association. And this is the format used not only in English composition, this course, but also classes like literature and history, humanities-based courses. If your course ends in ology, for example, biology, psychology, sociology, you most likely will use APA format, which stands for American Psychological Association. It's a format that isn't as familiar to some students, but if you've been in college for a while, there's a good chance you'll use it. However, we're just going to talk about MLA format. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the avoidance of plagiarism. And so what is that? Well, it results anytime a writer uses someone else's text, words, research, statistics, other information similar to that, and they hold it out in their essay as if it were their own. Now, I tend to think about plagiarism in three levels. So as a Boy Scout, I always taught third degree burns were the worst and had to be treated, very carefully. Third degree plagiarism is the worst. It's intentional, it's egregious, and it has consequences. And I've had students who've committed third degree plagiarism. Some have confessed, some have not. And sometimes the consequences can be severe. Most of what I run into are what I would call second or first degree instances. And these are usually careless errors that we can correct, usually in a first draft or hopefully with some peer review so that you're not making that exact same mistake, twice and doing it again in a final copy. So let's look at an egregious case first before we show you the right way to give credit, and then I'll finish up with a student example so you can see how it all comes together. So most people don't know who Dave Barry was. Dave Barry was the former superintendent of Zeeland Public Schools. Now, Mr. Barry was responsible not only for all this, but two rather large high schools, Zeeland West. Every now and then I have a student who is old enough to remember this incident, and he was accused of plagiarism from a blogger. And let me show you what actually happened, and you can read the whole article as well. I'll post that link. This is a newsletter that he had prepared, and I'm sorry I can't make it larger for you. It's called Focus, and these are the kinds of newsletters that leadership and education provide. It's a way of saying, go team, you're the best, kind of a rah-rah cheerleader type of piece of writing. But what happened was Dave Barry kind of left this to the last minute, and so he found an inspirational story from a blogger online, and he copied and pasted that story into his own newsletter. Now, it's hard to see, but everything you see in green here is word for word copied from that post. And nowhere in here does Dave Barry give credit for that. So he knew what he was doing. In fact, the article starts with him saying, "I made a mistake." But here's the deal. That blogger made a habit of searching the internet to see if anyone was using his material. And these newsletters, of course, from education, they end up all over the newsletter, school websites, teacher websites, things like that. So he contacted the school board and said, "Hey, this Dave Barry copied one of my pieces, never gave me credit for it, never contacted me." And so when Dave Barry was confronted by school board leadership, he finally confessed and said, "Yes, I did this." But that's not the end of the story. Because he's in a position of educational leadership, Dave Barry had just destroyed his credibility, especially with older students. You can't really lead an educational student body and cheat and still expect to lead them. You can't expect one standard for yourself and another for your students. And so unfortunately, they gave him a choice, I believe, we're going to fire you or you can resign. And Dave Barry resigned. I think last I heard he was teaching at Western Michigan University, but he lost out on a big leadership opportunity. So how can we avoid that? Well, I'm going to show you how to give credit correctly. Limit the use of quotations. So what I tell people is only use quotations in these instances. When the language is especially vivid onto the point, I mean, you can't think of another way to paraphrase or summarize that. When exact wording is needed for technical accuracy, so there could be terminology in there, and that terminology is not, familiar to most people, and we want to give credit for specific words. This is especially true with research, technical sciences that have, measurements and procedures that aren't normally understood. Sometimes the author is the speaker on a position, and that's kind of a cool place to be because then you want to use their words, and it's like you bring another voice to stand by you in your essay. Sometimes authority or weight are important, so the words have a certain gravity to them, and so we want to quote those exactly. Sometimes the language of a source is actually the topic. And I had a great example of this a few years ago. I had a veteran who was writing about the policy toward LGBTQ service people, and that was called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And we put Don't Ask, Don't Tell in quotation marks. Now, it wasn't really a policy, and it wasn't very successful because obviously the whole premise was just don't say anything. Fortunately, I think President Biden has rolled back some of the limitations during the Trump era and made it easier for LGBT people to serve. But that was what they called it back then. And sometimes we want to use a signal to introduce what's going to come next. So usually you might say, according to Todd Sowell, or Kristen Walcott says. Now, whenever you see APSM and a page number, I'm talking about a pocket style manual. And a pocket style manual is a great resource. It's not a required book in this class, but it's the resource I go to for all my APA and MLA and Chicago style questions, but especially for MLA. It's not that expensive. Once you buy it, I think you'll hang on to it for your whole college career. It's that useful and even beyond. So whenever you see ESM, it means a pocket style manual, and it takes you to pages with many more explanations, details, and items that can help you out. So let's say I'm writing a paper on how much time people spend on the web. So I have this quote, and I want to use it. It's from Frederick Lane, and he has this point he's trying to make. The World Wide Web can be a tremendous time sink. In other words, it sort of sucks us in, just like social media do now. This is an older article. And so I want to use this quote. So I've introduced him by name. I've used the signal here, and here's the exact quotes around that. Now, you might notice that this is a number in parentheses. The only time you need a number in the parentheses is for pages. Now, most of your research is going to come from MCC databases when we get into research, and that's coming up in a couple of weeks. And when we start doing that, there aren't really physical page numbers. So you'll probably not have to use numbers in your parentheses, but you will have to use the author's last name if you come back to it again. So let's go back to our slide. Now notice again, this is what we do for the first use. So think of it as like a party. I'm saying to my guest, oh, I just brought Frederick Lane with me. We wouldn't leave him standing there by himself, and so we've introduced him. Now, let's say I come back to another piece I want to use from him. Here's a statistic that in terms of time spent on the internet, I have a feeling this might even be higher now since it's been older. This is an older article. So I've given this statistic. I want to get credit for it. I don't have to say, according to Frederick Lane or Frederick Lane points out anymore. I can just use parentheses around his last name. And again, if there's a page number. If there wasn't, we just close the parenthesis right here. Now I'm oversimplifying, but that's really all there is to it, to giving credit. Introduce for the first use. After that, it's all about those parentheses. let me tell you, it's a lot easier than it was when I went to school back in the 70s and 80s. So let's talk about an instance where plagiarism might come up. So this is an interesting piece, and it came from an essay. It says, for those not exercising self-control, surfing the web can be a tremendous time sink. No other medium can match the internet's number of materials and sheer distractive potential. So we're going to go back to the earlier passage. I want you to look at this, and then I feel like an eye doctor. Is it better this way or this way? Again, we'll go back to the source. This is the exact quote, and here's what a student put in the essay. So is this plagiarism? What do you think? The answer is yes. And here's the reason why. When that student looked at that quote, they copied and pasted it into the essay, and then they said, well, I'll just change a few words here and there. But this is the exact syntax, wording, and arrangement that was in that first quote from Lane. This is the situation I'm running into more and more in this cut and paste society that we live in, and especially in an academic setting. Just copying and pasting and changing a few words doesn't make it your own. So you have two choices. You can just quote him, like the early example. That's probably the safest way. Or what I tell people is kind of look away from the screen, think about it for a minute, and summarize in your own words what you found, or paraphrase, as we sometimes say. Here would be an acceptable paraphrase. For people with little self-control, the internet is an enormous distraction since it presents so much information. Now you're in a position where you're not going to have any plagiarism issues, and you can move on with your essay. Sometimes you'll run into what we call an indirect quote. In other words, the speaker is cited inside a different source. And we have a solution for that. And if you haven't run into this yet, trust me, you will. So we have this person, her name's Amy Smith, and she says, people who use quotes inside of quotes should be careful to acknowledge both the speaker as well as the source. Now, I just made that up. But let's say she appears in an article written by George Jones. So what I have to do is acknowledge that she didn't write the article. This is her speaking. It was Jones who wrote the article. Maybe he interviewed you or something like that. And so we use QTD in Jones, again, if there is a page number, and that stands for quoted in. So this is a solution for those kinds of quoted sources. What if you have a quote of more than 4 lines? This is what we call a block quotations. Now, I don't have a good example here, but I will show you one a little bit later in the semester. But to set that up, we will indent the entire quotation a 1/2 inch. Ironically, we don't use quotation marks around it, which seems counterintuitive, but again, I'll show you an example later. It's not urgent for us to look at now. And you can look at it if you have a pocket style manual, if you want to look up an example right away, you can find one there. So let's say you have a very long quote. Remember, anything over 4 lines is a block quotation. And by the way, I typically only allow 1 block quotation. So let's say you really only need the beginning and the end. That's what we call the ellipsis, that dot, dot, dot. So this is the long soliloquy by Hamlet, Act 3 of Shakespeare's famous play. And notice I'm cutting out the middle text and cutting to the last part here. And that's the appropriate use of the ellipsis. And the way we do it actually is we do actually hit period, and we hit the space bar, period, the space bar, period, and the space. A lot of people just hit the space bar 3 times. I will catch that, and you shouldn't really be doing that. You should be using space, period, space, period, space, period, space. I know, it's picky, but I'm an English teacher, so I have to be picky about some things. Notice also that we don't use the ellipsis at the beginning or the end, only in the middle. And this is another frequent error I've seen. I have a feeling that some students have probably been taught incorrectly about that. All right, so let's take a look at an example of a student who just recently, well, within I think a couple years now, practiced this in a short summary, something that we'll be doing next week. So this is an example of one of my students. His name was Jonathan, and he was really into film, and he was looking at this film, Vive Savez, My Life to Live. And so he did a short summary of an article he read. By the way, purple is my favorite color. This is called cursive for those of you who have never learned this before. Some of my students say, I can't read what you're writing. It's so sad we don't have cursive in the curriculum anymore. But he did a short summary. Here's the whole summary here. And in the assignment, I said, okay, you have to quote from this article 3 times. Now, here's the author. Her name is Anuya Madan. And she says, so we have her full name and a signal. And here's the whole quote. Then he comes back to another quote from her. His films are even more relevant for our times than his. Because I've already introduced her here, I just use Madan. Again, this is a non-paginated source. And then here's even a third quote. The dangers of pervasive consumer and materialistic culture in Western society, etc. gives credit again. Now, later on, we'll talk about the works cited or works cited page. We're going to avoid that for today, just to give you a kind of a shorter introduction. Now, is that all there is to giving credit in MLA? Not exactly, because sometimes there aren't authors, and we'll talk about that later. And so we have to use the article title. And there are more instances than not where there are tools on the actual sources that you have that will help you with the works cited page, which is why I want to save that discussion to when we have databases. The good thing is for essays for our first essay, we don't have usually much in the way of research. You might have a source now and then, but probably not. And so it's easy to just kind of ignore that, at least for the time being. So we'll come back to this over and over again in more detail. Feel free to watch this video or look at the slides again anytime you want for more information and more examples. Talk to you again soon.